Now we're going to consider externalities, which are another example where the marketplace doesn't always deliver the best outcome and there may be a role for government. What is an externality? Well, by definition, it's a case where the cost of producing or the benefits of consuming a good spill over to other people. Basically, whether you're producing something that costs spill over, maybe a pollution, or when you're consuming something the benefits spill over, it might actually be making people better off elsewhere. So what are examples of this? Well, the most famous example is pollution. In this case, it's a negative externality because, say, the plant producing electricity is burning oil or it's burning coal. It emits this kind of smog or smoke, sulfur dioxide to the atmosphere, and obviously is a harm to people in the community. So that's an example of a negative externality. The firm which is producing electricity doesn't experience those costs. The costs are borne by the people in the community who have to breathe the foul air. You can also have other kinds of negative externalities. Noise pollution, for example. If there's a factory that has very noisy machinery, then the neighborhood makes it hard for people to sleep in that area. So there's a lot of examples with negative externalities, and we'll see why exactly the market doesn't take those into account sufficiently. There are positive externalities. A common one is education. People who have an education tend to be more informed citizens. They can participate in the democracy better. It makes the country or the society better off, so it spills over. Another example of positive externalities, which takes place at universities or at think tanks or at laboratories, government laboratories, is research, basic research, which has spillovers, because once something is invented or an idea is created, it's very hard to keep possession of that. Sometimes you can with a patent, but often it just spreads and other people can use that. And so that's an example where the benefits spill over to other people. So that's a positive externality, an example of a positive externality. So how do we think about these externalities in terms of our models of the economy? Well, not surprisingly, we found a way to do this with supply and demand. So this is a picture that illustrates this idea with quantity on the horizontal axis and dollars on the vertical axis, and the usual downward sloping demand curve, which are the marginal benefits for this particular product. And we also have marginal cost represented by these upward sloping supply curves. Now note that I've drawn two supply curves in here. One is what's called the marginal private cost. And the marginal private cost is what the firm actually is going to experience. Marginal private cost, this particular line, is the firm's own cost. So if it's producing electricity, it's the cost the firm has to pay its workers, to pay the inputs to production of electricity, maintenance of the turbines, whatever it happens to be. That's the marginal private cost. But there's this extra cost that is due to the pollution. And that extra cost is an additional cost, so that the marginal social cost is actually higher by that amount compared to the marginal private cost. The marginal social cost is the real cost of society. The firm doesn't experience that when it makes its decision. So now, given that concept, the marginal social cost is higher than the marginal private cost, we can analyze the impact. So the firm is going to ignore the marginal social cost. It's going to maximize profits. And as we know, in that circumstance, we'll get a level of production in the market where the marginal benefit curve intersects the marginal private cost curve. That is, the demand curve intersects the supply curve. And you can see in the picture that's illustrated by a point just called the market. Now, the problem with that is the production doesn't take account of the marginal social cost, this extra cost of the pollution. And if you took that into account, the amount of production would be less. It would be the intersection of the supply curve, which includes those social costs, marginal social costs, and the demand curve. So it would be over here, which is a smaller amount of production than it would take place in the market. The measure of the costs of that, of ignoring those marginal social costs, is the deadweight loss, once again, because the efficient quantity in the diagram is lower than the market. The market is producing too much. It's producing too much in this case. So there's a deadweight loss, as is always the case when you're off the efficient quantity. Efficient quantity, again, is where the marginal social cost equals the marginal benefit. And the deadweight loss is just the difference between the true marginal cost, which is the marginal social cost, and the marginal benefit. And so the cost of producing that, if you like, extra electricity is greater than the benefits, and because the marginal costs include the effect on people who have to breathe the bad air. So that's how you analyze this negative externality with supply and demand diagram. Of course, you can do the same thing with the positive externality. Here you want to think about moving the marginal benefit curve, for an example. So in this case, we have a single marginal cost curve representing the cost of producing. Maybe this is producing education or research. And on the demand curve, we have two. We have a marginal benefit curve. One is private and the other is social. The marginal private benefit curve is the benefits that people get from their education, from the training, whatever it happens to be. The marginal social benefit is the extra benefit to society that occurs because of that education of those individuals. So we can do the analysis the same way. In the case of ignoring the marginal social benefit, the amount that will be produced by the market is indicated there. If you take into account the higher marginal social benefits in this case, the curve is going to be higher because the benefits are higher, then you produce this much. And so the efficient quantity is higher than the market produces. You're not producing enough education in this case, or you're not producing enough research in this case. And the cost to society, because of this inefficient level of production in the market, is again illustrated by the deadweight loss, in which you're seeing this area here, these goods produced in this area, the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal cost. They should have been produced. That extra research should have taken place. The extra education should have taken place. So that's the problem with externalities. Now the question is, what do we do about this? What's the remedy? What's the possible remedy for it? And people have had different ideas over the years. Economists have been working on this for a while. And, oh, geez, what is that? I just have to walk over here. Let me find what's going on. Geez, what are you doing? Hey, look, we can work something out. Here's what I suggest. Oh, you don't like that? Well, we'll try this other thing here. I don't know. What are we going to do? Oh, we'll work it out. I got an idea. This will be done. Okay, so let me tell you what happened here. Makes things a little strange, me waking off like that. But it turns out there's this studio where we're in. Next door is another studio. That studio is also doing some recording of a teacher that's a class in the history of rock and roll music. And to communicate the ideas to people, they want to play the rock and roll music really loud. Unfortunately, the studios are so close, when they play it loud, it comes over into this studio too. Actually, it's an example of an externality. It's an example of noise pollution. And so the question is, what are we going to do about it? Well, it turns out I worked out a deal with the instructor in the other studio. And she said that she'll only play the music at the beginning of each of our lessons in the future and at the end. And that way people can get up for the lessons and feel good after the lessons. But during the lessons, you can hear the actual economics. So it seems like a good solution, and the class can benefit still from the loud music at different points in the lesson. Now the only thing is, since she really has the rights to this area, I really had to pay her something to do this. But I figured that people working here with me in the studio, Colin and other people willing to contribute, it would just be a few bucks each time we record. So you just have to contribute. What do you think? Were you willing to contribute? No? No one wants to contribute? Well, I guess that's the end of that idea. So it's not going to work. We have to figure another way to reduce and offset this externality. So as you can see with this little example, it's possible in principle to work out a deal, work out an arrangement to remedy these externalities. Sometimes it may require a payment. And if it's a payment, you have to think about who has the property rights. In this little example, the instructor doing history of rock and roll music really had the property rights, and we had to find a way to pay her. It would have worked out if there wasn't another problem, and that is the transactions costs. Quite frankly, to interrupt a lesson like this and walk off and have an argument with somebody is pretty costly. I hate to do that, so as a transaction cost, you don't want to have to do that. Moreover, we saw this free rider problem. People in the studio here were unwilling to pay anything. So if they're not willing to pay anything to make this work, it's not going to work. So while a private remedy is workable, sometimes it's not always workable, and this example of noise pollution with the rock and roll music illustrates that. The idea of having a private remedy like this is due to an economist named Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize for that and other contributions. So it's an important thing to consider whenever you have an externality. Is it possible actually to go back to the marketplace and see if there's a way to remedy that? And as technology improves, I believe there'll be more ways to use private remedies in this case. But you can see it doesn't always work. And that's why there's a reliance on government to deal with it. And one way you can think about government coming in is just to command and control people not to do the things that are causing the externality. So in this case, it could simply be telling the instructor in the history of rock and roll not to play the music. Now, she may not like that, and the people benefiting from this excellent course might not like it. We might like it studying economics, but that's the way it's going to end if there's this command and control. The command and control, the decision might be something else. It might be that we have to interrupt and listen to rock and roll music every few minutes. So that's the idea behind command and control. You impose a specific set of requirements on people to try to deal with the externality. It's sometimes called social regulation, economic regulation. We've defined as a case where a government controls the price and entry into an industry. Social regulation is examples like this. It's a way to regulate this pollution. It's a way to deal with some of these societal problems of excess costs. There's many examples of this. In the case of pollution from electricity production, the sulfur dioxide goes in the air. The government would require the firms to put scrubbers in their smokestacks to reduce those emissions. In the case of gasoline, the government has restrictions on how many miles per gallon a fleet of cars must get. Say 27.3 is a recent example. 27.3 miles per gallon is the corporate average fuel economy requirement that's put on automobile manufacturers. That's another example. The government commands a certain amount of miles per gallon in an effort to reduce the amount of pollution from gasoline cars. Problems with command and control, it's sometimes not very flexible. I think you can see the example with the history of rock and roll, or even the scrubbers. There might be better ways to reduce pollution than scrubbers. There even might be better ways to reduce pollution than requiring that firms build cars that have certain miles per gallon. After all, if it's low miles per gallon, people might actually drive more because it's cheaper, and you might get just as much as pollution. Maybe there's other ways you can discourage people from consuming the gasoline than command and control. So while it is potentially a remedy to the externalities, it's not very flexible in general and frequently not efficient. So there's other ways that economists have thought about dealing with. Probably the most commonly used, most widely discussed, is the use of taxes or subsidies. The idea behind this is to make people or firms who have an external negative externalities feel some of the pain of that, experience some of the costs. Or those that the production provides a positive externality, make those people feel some of the gain, so they do a little more of it. So the pain, they'll do a little less, reduce the externality, and adding to the gain, making them feel better, they may produce more. As you'll see, it's more flexible than command and control, because once this extra cost or extra gain is taken into account, people are free to determine the best way to deal with it. And in addition, there's a disadvantage because you actually can't control the total amount of pollution if you use taxes or subsidies, or if you put a cap on how much can be polluted, how much noise pollution or how much air pollution, you get to fix the total. In the case of taxes or subsidies, as you'll see in a minute, it's not possible to control the total amount. You can reduce it, but you don't know exactly by how much. So how does this work exactly? Well, we can use the supply and demand diagram again. Same kind of diagram we used earlier to describe what an externality is. So in this case, I've drawn in the marginal benefit curve, as usual. That's the demand curve. I've drawn in two marginal cost curves, one private and one social, just as we did before to illustrate this negative externality. And we can see right away that the efficient quantity at this point is lower than the inefficient quantity. There's too much production of this good because firms don't take into account the social costs. But the remedy now is the tax, and that's the new part of this picture. The remedy basically is to say, okay, let's put a tax on this production. So you raise the marginal private cost up to, if you're really clever and accurate, exactly equal to the marginal social cost. So the tax should be just about enough to bring you to that point along the whole curve. And so in this case, you can see what's happening. The tax is going to effectively make the firms experience that marginal social cost. They're going to have to pay a tax equal to the marginal social cost, and therefore they should be able to adjust their production. And indeed, that's what the theory will tell you. They will tell you if the firms experience that higher marginal social cost, then they will produce at the point where the marginal benefit equals marginal social cost at the intersection of the demand curve with this supply curve, now including the tax. So the tax has really has been a remedy for this negative externality. We're now producing the efficient quantity because of the tax. So it works pretty well. You can do the same thing for a positive externality. In this case, say education or research. Now it involves a subsidy. Here we have a situation where the private benefit is generating too little production of education or research, inefficient. We want to get more, so what we can do is subsidize that basic research activity or subsidize the education. It may be through a grant, it may be through the actual public provision of the education through public schools, maybe scholarships provided by the government, whatever. It's a subsidy, so you are raising the marginal private benefit up to the marginal social benefit by the amount of the subsidy. And if you get it just right, you move it up to the right amount, then you're going to get an increase in production to the efficient point over there, which is what the objective of this tax intervention, this subsidy intervention was. Now in reality, of course, it's hard to estimate these marginal social benefits and marginal social costs, but the concept is very clear. And what we would like to do is try to apply these kinds of ideas in practice as much as possible. Now, one disadvantage of the taxes or the subsidies is you can't really control exactly how much will be produced because there could be a shift in marginal cost or there could be a shift in the marginal benefit. So if you go back to the curve which I just illustrated here, suppose you put that tax in place as I indicated, then suppose that there is a change in costs or change in benefits other than this, then you're actually going to get a change in the amount of production. So for example, you might find that there's a shift in the curve for marginal benefit. It might go something like that. People really kind of like this kind of activity, but it's going to cause more pollution. So you can't control the total amount. You're going to get a different amount in this case if this actually occurs. So for these situations, another idea has been proposed, which is sometimes called cap and trade. Cap and trade is an interesting alternative way to control and limit pollution. In this case, the government will decide how much total emissions there should be. So sulfur dioxide that makes the air hard to breathe and causes problems with people's health in an area, you decide how much total we can have, and you put a cap on that for the area. It could be Southern California, it could be part of Texas, whatever it happens to be. They put a cap on that for the total. And then firms who want to pollute more than that, their share, they have to get a permit to do that. For government will issue a permit equal to the total amount of pollution. But then firms can trade. Some firms who are really efficient at reducing their pollution, they can sell their permits to firms that find it more difficult and they would like to pollute more because their costs of reducing the pollution are higher. So these permits trade in the market, and that's why the word trade is used. These permits trade in the market, and firms can buy and they can sell them. There will actually be a market where the price will be determined. Price will fluctuate. And the total amount is limited as a result of this. Unlike the tax, where you could have movements in the total amount. In this case, the total amount is controlled. You still get some efficiencies because you're putting the effort to reduce pollution in the areas where firms are best at it, and not so much where it's hard to do. Different types of firms, different types of locations, different types of production. This idea has been successful for the sulfur dioxide pollution, and it's been proposed many times for the global warming, the carbon dioxide, carbon emissions. However, it has not been used in the U.S. yet, although it has been used and will be used in certain states, including the state of California. So these are the examples of how economists have thought to deal with the externalities, which you can illustrate again with the basic models. And you can see there are pros and cons for each one of these alternatives. The argument we're trying to make here in going through the economics is that the economists can help you figure out what the best way is to do this in a way that gets the efficient outcome and minimizes the cost to society. Thank you very much.